Thank you very much. Is that working? Can you hear me? No? Is my mic on? Do I have to do something? Maybe I have to turn it on. No, it's on. Oh, well, I guess I can start over here. So we're going to move away from food slightly and talk about some of the other things that I think are important in terms of chronic health or health problems. And I'd like to thank Professor Noakes very much for prefacing my talk by saying, yes, there are some other things that are important, lifestyle, blah, blah, blah. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So just very, very quickly, though you might not tell it from my accent, I am half Icelandic. I do have an alter ego. I like to think of myself as the medical Jason Bourne. I am also known as Tómas Ragnar Bernhardsson. You can listen to me on Kastljós talking my dubious Icelandic later on. So Marianne very, very kindly talked about my previous degrees. On the side, I am Chief Medical Officer of a fabulous functional medicine clinic called Nourish, Balance, Thrive. And in my spare time, with people like my girlfriend, who's a professor of chemical engineering, and Gudmund Johansson, who's the CEO of Icelandic Health Symposium, we've been modeling insulin resistance, which is something we've talked about a lot today. And actually, Gary, I think we've managed to figure out where fat and carbohydrate are interacting in the diet, and it's actually very simple. But actually, I'm not going to talk about that either. So I'm going to try and bring together a number of things, and what this really makes me think about, the question I want to ask is, what does it take to make a healthy human? And I think, I've heard some of my idols speak today about diet and how that affects health, and I was very glad that I got to sort of help talk about people I'd like to hear, and then they turned up and I got to listen to them speak, which was fantastic. But I think there are a lot of other things that are important that we should make sure we don't let fall by the wayside when we're busy arguing about carbs versus fat. So I'm going to take you through a few. We're going to start fairly conventional, and then we're going to head further into the weeds, so I hope you enjoy the ride. Movement. So we've heard from a number of people today that you can't out-exercise a poor diet. No matter how hard Ronald McDonald tries, he's never going to get rid of those Big Macs. And the thing is that if you're trying to exercise for weight loss, we know that that balance, that equation doesn't work very well. And this is a graph that I've taken from a recent study. And what people used to think, here we have our energy expenditure on the left, here we have physical activity going on the x-axis, and people thought that you have this sort of basic amount of doing your daily chores, that's the standard amount of calories you burn, and then you add exercise and that just increases and everything goes up and up and up and up. But in reality, what happens is that as you increase physical activity, your body compensates. So you can get a little bit of increase in the amount of calories you burn, but then actually you start to decrease energy you spend the rest of the time. So you move less when you're sitting, you may not be bothered to get up and change the channel on the TV, and actually overall the amount of calories that you can burn and fat you can lose just through exercise doesn't really fit the equation. So then one of the problems that I think that we haven't spoken about is not just that we're not doing enough exercise, but actually what we're doing spending most of our day. And so we looked at the perfect man earlier on, he's probably somewhere around here, and then we eventually picked up, we started to farm, and then we picked up power tools, and now we spend our days hunched over a desk like that. And we know that we can't outrun a poor diet, but did you know that you can't outrun sitting? So this is a graph from a recent meta-analysis, which basically shows the number of hours you sit per day, and this is overall risk of mortality, so how likely you are to die. And you can see this is adjusted for activity, so this is adjusted for how much exercise people do, and particularly as you increase the amount of time you spend sitting from 8 to 12 hours, then the average is this thick black line here, you basically double your risk of death just from sitting. And there's a number of reasons why that happens that I won't go into, but basically, you have all had your allocation of sitting today, so you can't sit anymore once you leave, just so you know. So I'm not going to really bang on about this, but there's lots of different reasons why you should move, and it affects pretty much every aspect of the body. I was talking earlier about mental health. It's very important. Many types of cancer, heart disease, all improved by getting at least some movement. And this is a nice graph which basically shows that if you increase activity, and where you're getting the most benefit, this is about 3 or 4 hours a week of brisk walking, yoga, swimming, something like that. So I'm definitely not saying that everybody needs to go out and run marathons all the time. And actually, when people do start to run marathons all the time, this happens. And actually, it probably increases their risk of death. And one of the reasons why this happens is this is another very, very recent study, and we talk a lot about antioxidants and oxidative stress, free radicals in the body, and people spend lots of money on supplements to try and, because they're full of antioxidants and that's good for us. But one of the ways that we actually signal in the body, especially if we're talking insulin resistance, the way we signal insulin is using oxidative stress or reactive oxygen species. So some is good, lots is bad. But this is a very interesting study. So here we have 3 groups: well-trained, moderately trained, untrained. So these guys training more than 6 hours a week, these guys training about 4 hours a week, and then guys who are just sitting around all day. And this is the amount of glutathione. So this is the main antioxidant in the body. This is the really, really good stuff. This is the stuff that we want that's gonna help keep us healthy. It's gonna help keep us insulin sensitive. People who are moderately trained have a lot more glutathione available before exercise and again after exercise. And people who are training a lot more actually have the same amount as people who are not training at all. So when you're saying that somebody is insulin resistant despite lots of exercise, it might be that they're insulin resistant because of all that exercise. But that's a matter for a different day. So I made this graph for an article I wrote, and it was basically trying to help men understand why their penises aren't working, and that's really the only time that they really pay attention. And so this is the amount of morning glory that you get. This is the amount of exercise you're doing, and we know that men who don't do any have problems with erectile dysfunction, and actually exercise is one of the best ways to improve erectile dysfunction. But then we see a lot of guys who are doing Ironman training, traveling around the world all the time, and then they come down the other side and they start to wonder why. So you can definitely have too much of a good thing. So then whenever we're working with people, they always say, okay, fine, that's all very interesting, biochemistry, blah, tell me what to do. So this is what you should do. You should move every day. 30 to 60 minutes is plenty. I'm a big fan of brisk walking, and that will come up again later. And actually, breaking up long periods of sitting is probably even more important. They've shown that if somebody gets up every hour, walks for 5 minutes, that's much better for improving their glucose control, insulin sensitivity, than going for a half-hour walk in one go. So movement snacks, moving all the time. So it's not that we go and we drag ourselves to the gym for an hour, it's just making sure that we're moving as often as possible. So next, stress. Stress is this really ethereal concept that's very difficult to quantify, and it's also very difficult to study because of that, and it's very different from person to person. So first I just thought I'd start with a very brief description of stress. So it's simply a reaction to a stimulus that disturbs our physical or mental equilibrium. In other words, it is an omnipresent part of life. It can trigger a fight or flight response, increasing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. A little bit of stress, known as an acute stress, can be exciting. It can also be good for us. But in the long term, chronic stress can have detrimental effects on our health. And most importantly, you may not be able to control the stresses in your world, but you can alter your reaction to them. So it's very important to realize that there is no such thing as stress. It is just how you respond to the stressor. And that's actually very, very difficult to change, but that's the thing that we need to deal with. But then when we're actually looking at the effect of stress on health, this basically covers it. So there are studies that cover all of this. So all of these things on the left-hand side are considered stressors. So we're going from socioeconomic status, factors in childhood, abuse, depression, the diet, jobs particularly. And then we sort of perceive this in a certain way, how we respond to it. And then it increases all these other things that we've heard a little bit about. Stress hormones like cortisol particularly, adrenaline. Then we heard a little bit about inflammation earlier. So these are some of the inflammatory things that get increased, like interleukin-6, TNF-alpha. And then the downstream effect of that is that all of these can then affect these. So these are the things we talked about to do with insulin resistance, metabolic disease. So we're talking about all the different types, triglycerides going up, particularly triglyceride to HDL ratio going up, blood pressure going up. And again, more inflammation, and then this is going to affect everything from our mental health to our physical health, our quality of life, and increase our risk of death. But how much does that really matter? So we're talking about heart disease. This is a nice study. This is more than 200,000 people. And these are people asked about their job stress. And you can see that regardless of age, sex, or socioeconomic status, if you're stressed at work, this increases your risk of cardiovascular disease by about 30 to 40%, which is actually pretty good going. And then similarly, actually, I thought about this slide because you've come here and you listen to 4 experts on low-carb diets talk about low-carb diets, and then Denise Minger turns up and she starts talking about low-fat diets, and then you're like, wait, well, what on earth am I going to eat? And then, so diet stress is really important. This is something that people really fixate upon, and not to generalize, but it is usually women who fixate upon it, and that's just a fact. And so this is a group of women, and you look at them and you basically ask them what they're eating, and you ask them how restrained they feel in their diet. So how much are you worrying about what you eat? And then they basically have a low restraint group and a high restraint group. These guys are the same age, the same weight, they're the same BMI. Those who stress more have more weight fluctuation. They actually exercise more despite weighing the same amount. But actually their cortisol, which is this main stress hormone, is about 20 to 30% higher. So these women are just stressed all the time because they're worried about their diet, and it's not helping any of this. So again, we get back to tell me what to do. And I think what's really important is that, and this again will come up again later, is that you need to talk. You talk to people. This is something that we're doing less and less. And actually, talk to your friends, talk to your family, even talk to a professional if you need to. But actually getting your stress back under control, but actually talking about it and taking control of it is really important. There's some very good studies showing that mindfulness, meditation, yoga, and Tai Chi can actually actively reduce our cortisol response to stressors, so we can actually measure the physiology of doing those things. They're very important. Again, I come back to walking, because I think walking is something that you can do in the middle of your day, particularly if you have job stress. And they've shown, again, that you get reduced stress responses if you go walking outside, particularly in green spaces. That's better than walking in the city. And actually, you don't have to go very far to walk in like open countryside here in Reykjavik. And I've put this question mark here, walk barefoot, because when we're talking about heart disease, there's a really interesting study where they took people and they connected them to the earth. And then they measured the electric charge on their red blood cells, and it had actually changed such that the red blood cells were less likely to clump together, as happens during a heart attack. So you can actually affect the electric charge on your cells by touching the earth. And I put in question mark because this is, a little bit, interesting. But it's, take your shoes off and go for a walk, and actually you might be surprised the effects that it can have. Or you can just quit your job. But don't tell them I told you that. Okay, light. Did you know there's a clock in your head? You probably did, but you may not know exactly what it does. So we have a clock. It's based in something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And what it does is it basically regulates everything that happens in your body throughout the day. So you might have heard of melatonin. This is the main sleep hormone. This goes up at night. At the same time, your body temperature goes down. And we talked about cortisol, and this sort of goes up during the night, and it peaks in the morning, and it helps support you waking up and helps increase your blood glucose in the morning and getting your temperature up and getting you ready for the day. And all of this is controlled by your brain, and all of this runs like clockwork, or it should do. So then when we talk about the things that are regulated by this, there are over 600 genes that are changed on a daily basis, hour by hour, based on the circadian clock in your head. And these can affect lots of different things, but the most important thing is they, in the context of this, is they can affect your metabolism. So the circadian rhythm can actively change the way you respond to the macronutrients in your diet. So when we're talking about carbs versus fat, what actually determines the way your body is responding to those macronutrients at what time of day is all based on these genes and your circadian rhythm. So if we're talking about the important things that you need to fix in order to respond to the diet correctly, circadian rhythm is actually the daddy. And this is what's meant to happen. So we're meant to be awake and eat, and then we're meant to be asleep and not eat, and that's also very important. And we see, so we're mostly insulin sensitive in the morning, but then if we do things like don't sleep, then our insulin resistance increases, or if we eat late at night, our insulin resistance increases, and all of this is meant to fluctuate throughout the day. And we know that if we're looking at people with metabolic disease, they have disrupted the circadian rhythm. So their cortisol doesn't have the same normal daily variation that we expect. They don't produce enough melatonin at night. So then we're not seeing these daily fluctuations in hormones. And we know that they have higher inflammation, they have higher stress hormones. And we also know that when people are circadian disrupted, so they're not sleeping properly, they don't have a normal circadian rhythm, it drives hunger along with a stress response. It changes all the hormones in our body that make us hungry. So a disrupted circadian rhythm can actively change the way that we eat. We also know that if we sleep poorly, then if we're trying to lose weight, then that will happen more slowly and will also generally lead to worse cognition. So a poor sleep is very tightly linked to Alzheimer's disease, which is obviously, again, linked to insulin resistance. And did you know that after only one night of sleep deprivation, 4 hours sleep deprivation, your insulin sensitivity is the same as somebody who is pre-diabetic without changing anything else? We also know that if we eat out of phase, this can make us insulin resistant. So eating snacks at night, particularly carbohydrate-based snacks, but can also happen a little bit with protein. Interestingly, if you take patients on an intensive care unit, and because they're usually very sick and they have a very high calorie demand, what we do is we feed them around the clock. So we put a tube in their nose, down into their stomach, and we feed them all the time. And what we see is that if you feed them continuously or you feed them overnight, which is what many people do because it's convenient, they are more likely to develop insulin resistance and fatty liver because you're feeding them at a time that they shouldn't be fed. You're feeding them while they're asleep. Very similarly, we know that people who do shift work have an increased risk of obesity, insulin resistance, and many types of cancer. And these are people who can never establish a normal circadian rhythm because they're always working at a different time. So if we're trying to entrain our circadian rhythm and try and get it back on track if it's broken or try and keep it in the right place, there are two things that we can do. We can expose ourselves to light at the right times, and we can eat at the right times. And then these will then feed back and allow us to respond to the world in the right way. So this is an interesting study. So this is the first light during the day. They looked at people and they looked at the most amount of light that they were exposed to during the day, and you set your circadian clock by the time you first see the brightest amount of light in your day. And you'll see that the later in the day that people are going out and seeing bright, some kind of bright light, this could be artificial light or sunlight, the higher their BMI. So you've shifted their circadian rhythm away from the normal daylight cycle, and that's actively affecting their weight. Very similarly, we talk a lot about light at night. So I talked about melatonin. Normal melatonin rhythm is very, very important for glucose metabolism. And one of the things that stops you secreting melatonin is blue light. So here you have guys, just before bed, they were asked to read on a tablet like an iPad, and they saw that their melatonin was suppressed by about 20 to 30%. And you can make this even worse if you had a bright light. This is a blue LED, but if you had a bright light in the room at the same time. So what do you guys do before you go to bed? Very, very similarly, so this is another study where they took people and they either had them read a real book, like an actual book, or an e-book, and then this is their melatonin, and you see that the melatonin, the people that read the e-book, it peaks much later and there's lower overall secretion. And melatonin is also very important for lots of other things, like it's a very powerful antioxidant and regulates a number of genes, and you actually want that to happen at the right time. Very similarly, so this is essentially the same study, and these people read an iPad or a book, and this, you might not be able to see it that well, but this is the EEG power. So this is basically they put electrodes on people's heads, and the delta waves are what sends people to sleep, into really good, high-quality restorative sleep. And the guys who read a normal book had a nice peak in their delta wave activity, which then came back down throughout the night. And those people who read from a screen, from an iPad, didn't get that at all. So these people, even though they're technically asleep, they are not getting the normal restorative sleep that we need in order to set our circadian rhythm. And I always like people, we've seen a number of graphs today. We showed that in 1970, the dietary guidelines came into play, or actually they came into play in 1980, but sort of rapidly increased. This is from the UK. In obesity since 1970, increased from almost 0 up to 25%. In the same time, we've had a 3 times increase in the amount of artificial light that we're exposed to at night. And you'll see this is actually data going back to the 1700s, and this is a logarithmic scale, so each one up is a multiple of 10. So from the 1800s up to now, we are exposed to 10,000 times more light at night. And this is what regulates our circadian rhythm, and that's what regulates our metabolism. So tell me what to do. Again, we need to daylight anchor. So it's very important to get bright light at the right time. So you need to go outside during the day and do it early in the morning, and that sets your normal circadian rhythm. I talked about avoiding blue light at night. So one thing you can do is blue blocking glasses. Avoid screens after dark. You could light some candles, maybe read a book, maybe do something else. And you can also get some things for your screens to make them not emit blue light and stuff, but maybe we should actually be doing less of that around bedtime anyway. Eat and move during the day. So actually you set your circadian rhythm by eating at the right times of day, and that's very important. So not eating late at night is very important. And then again, just very similarly, if you exercise within 3 or 4 hours sleep, sometimes that can affect your sleep, so it's just important to do that slightly earlier in the day. This is my girlfriend modeling some very nice blue blocking glasses. As you can see, she is very impressed by them. All right, last one, love. All right, now we're really getting a bit woo, and with this comes meaning. So we'll try and figure this out. And I'm going to tell you a story that I have directly stolen from somebody called Brian Walsh, who's a very clever functional medicine practitioner, who has highlighted a lot of this research to a number of people. And if you go back to our hunter-gatherer days, where we lived in a village, so say we're a village, everybody has a job. A doctor, a farmer, maybe I'm the village idiot. We all have our purpose. We have a purpose, and our purpose is to help the people in the village do their thing, eat, be healthy. And when we're in that scenario, we've done some very good studies, from animals to humans. And if you take any animal and you isolate it, it automatically dies sooner. It dies earlier. And what you see is that when you're in this kind of state and you're part of a community and you have this meaning of life, you look at somebody's hormones, their inflammatory hormones, and their levels of inflammation are actually lower. They have lower inflammation because they're in this group setting. And it makes perfect sense, because if you're in that setting, you need to be very responsive to disease, because you might be living in close quarters, and then you can actually actively get a virus, and you want to deal with it quickly. And that's what you can do, because you're very good at making antibodies in this state. But actually, if you've got an injury, then there's somebody to look after you, so you don't need to be on constant vigilance for injury, and then your inflammation can actually be lower. But then if the next village comes and attacks your village, and then you get burned to the ground, and your family gets killed, and you're left alone all in the wilderness, what actually then happens is that your inflammation increases, because you need to be able to deal with whatever comes as quickly as possible. So you cut your leg open, you get attacked, you get eaten by something, and actually your inflammation rises to try and deal with that. And what we're actually seeing in people is when they're socially isolated, when they're actually isolated, their inflammation increases. And we've talked about how inflammation is so important for health in general. Their inflammation increases, and it actually increases or decreases our ability to deal with things like cancer cells, because we've created this state where our immune system isn't regulated properly. And you might think that this doesn't really make any sense in the modern world, but I kind of feel like this is what we're doing all the time. So even though you have hundreds or thousands of friends on Facebook, like my mum does, she has a lot more than I do, you have all these friends and you're connected to all these people, but how many of those people could you really rely on in an important situation? How many of those people could you really tell your woes to? Like when everything really gets down and everything goes wrong, who could you really talk to? And I think there's a huge fraction of our society that just doesn't really have that anymore. And then when we talk about the effect on health, there's actually been fairly well studied. So this is a meta-analysis published a year ago. Almost 3.5 million people followed for 7 years, and social isolation, loneliness, and living alone increased the risk of mortality by 30%. And other studies showed that social isolation increased the risk of mortality the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's difficult to compare them directly, but it's not an insignificant effect on our health. Very similarly, this was published just the other day. 30% increase in stroke and heart disease just due to social isolation. And then this comes to the idea of how we're living our lives. So hedonism, as we know, which is kind of like just looking after ourselves and trying to entertain ourselves, and it's all very about self-gratification. And if you look at people and how they live their lives, again, you can look at their genes and you can look at their inflammation, and they're different. So this is published in the PNAS, which is a very, very respected journal. And you look at people and you ask them how they live their lives, how they derive happiness from their lives. And there are people who have more of a hedonistic lifestyle. So maybe they're posting selfies on social media. Whatever they're doing is just to gain recognition. Whatever they're doing is, buying new shoes, buying, whatever it is, just to make themselves feel good. And then there's the other type of people, the eudaimonic people, who then are actually getting their happiness by helping others, by being selfless, volunteering, things like that. And you see the same thing. So in those who are leading a hedonistic lifestyle, they have an increase in inflammation and a decrease in antibody production, so they're going to be less able to deal with illnesses. And the other way around are people who are eudaimonic, so actually no real effect on their inflammation, and actually they're very good at producing antibodies, so they're very good at responding to infection. So these people, their immune system is in a much better state overall, just by how they're living their lives. So I was going to tell you what to do, then the problem is that it's a simple answer, but it doesn't mean it's very easy to do. So I'll basically just tell you to go out and make some friends. But actually, I'm not really sure that that's that easy. We also know that men who get married live a lot longer, but it doesn't work for women. So bear that in mind. But then you go and contribute to something, find something that you believe in, and contribute to a higher purpose can actually have an effect on your physiology. It's not just airy-fairy kind of stuff. And I think it's also very important to practice gratitude and be thankful for the things that you have. And again, this has been shown to reduce our stress response to stressors. And also tell people that you love them. So if you're trying to put this all together, actually, I often think about the blue zones, which are the places on the Earth where people live the longest. And it's very debated about what they eat and how many carbs and how much fat and all that fun, and we can do that too. But these are the people who have the most centenarians, so people who live to be over 100 years old in the world. And if you look at what these people do, they are active. They don't exercise, but they move every day, and they never finish what they do. They always have a purpose or a part of the group. They always have a way of modifying stress. So if we're talking about the Okinawans in Japan, then they spend a lot of time thinking about their elders. The Seventh-day Adventists in California, they pray. The Nicoyans from Costa Rica, they just go out walking in the wilderness. And when they do eat, they eat locally grown food together, and that gives them a sense of community. So we talked a lot about pyramids, and this is actually the blue zone pyramid. You see the bottom is actually being part of a community, putting other people's, having some kind of spiritual connection, putting other people before yourself. Then comes food and wine. And then comes having goals, modifying stress, and being active. And I think this kind of gives us, the basis of how we should actually be looking to live our lives. And then I think, like I said, I'm the chief medical officer of this functional medicine clinic, and I was sort of like brought in later on, and it was founded by Chris, who's in the audience, and his wife, Julie. And the people that come to Nourish, Balance, Thrive, they could be athletes that are just trying to get faster, but there are also a lot of people who have spent thousands and thousands of dollars working with literally the best doctors, like brilliant doctors, and not getting the results that they want, and then they do really well when they come to us. And I'm not saying that these other people don't know what they're doing, because I know what they're doing, and they're doing really, really great work, but I think I went into our client folder, and I just picked up a random health plan. So the first time you talk to Chris, he gives you a health plan before, to do some stuff before, he then talks to you again and see how you're doing. And it looks like this. So often we tell people they're under-eating, which is interesting. We tell them to learn how to cook, to look after their water. Then we start talking about sleep, getting outside during the day, get some light during the day and avoid bright lights at night. Find some way to interact socially, either with your family or friends, walk more, again, outdoors, get your friends involved, and find some way to reduce stress and do it in whatever way suits you. And this is the stuff that works. Like, this is the stuff that gets people healthy. And then, all the other diets, who maybe we're treating an infection or something like that, that just, that's just the icing on the cake. This is the stuff that really gets people better. So I always try and end on this slide. And we talked a lot about carbohydrates and protein and fat, and I think nobody can really argue that the processed food environment and a lot of environmental toxins and lots of things that are sort of affecting our health negatively. But I really do believe that if we don't focus on this stuff in the middle, then you have to be more restrictive on the outside. We need to focus more on our carbohydrate intake or more on our fat intake. And it's because it's this stuff, it's things like our circadian biology, it's stuff like the way that we're actually interacting with the world, that determines our metabolic health, which determines the way that we respond to our diet. And I just wanted to end with some words from, again, the brilliant Tim Noakes, which is that we are in a zoo and we're eating zoo food. But I want people to think about the fact, is it the zoo food or is it the zoo? Thank you very much.